ISLM model, an introduction. First, let me draw the two curves. But first, on the y-axis, the interest rate in percent, 0, and on the x-axis, GDP. IS, negatively sloped in most instances. LM, positively sloped in most instances. IS, it's a summary of the goods and services market. LM, it's the summary of the money market, the financial market. So you have two markets, the goods and services market and the money market, represented in the ISLM model. The IS curve, why is it negatively sloped? That's most of the time. All right, let's see. Interest rate, GDP level, positively sloped. It's positively sloped because, well, let's see. Let's say initially we are at this point here. And let's say that eventually we are at point number 2. So we're moving down and along the IS curve. Now, in regards to the IS curve, changes in the interest rate are the cause, and changes in the GDP level, well, that's the result. That's the consequence. All right? So that's important to identify. So let's see. Why is the IS curve negatively sloped? Because if the interest rate decreases, if we move from point 1 to point 2 on the IS curve, well, what happens? Physical investments go up. And as a result, what happens to GDP? It increases. So we started at this level here, I1 and Y1. For some reason, the interest rate fell from I1 to I2. And what happened? The GDP level increased because of an increase in the physical investment level. Why is it negatively sloped? Well, there's another part to it. If the interest rate decreases, then physical investments go up, then national income goes up, and as national income goes up, what happens to disposable income? It goes up. And in turn, what happens to consumption? It also goes up. And as a result, what happens to Y? It also goes up. All right? So that was reason number 2. Let me use a different color. Blue. Reason 3. If the interest rate decreases, then the question becomes, what happens to international capital flows? Will it be inflows or outflows? It'll be outflows. And as a result of these outflows, what's going to happen to the ER? ER being the exchange rate, the international value of this currency. Well, the exchange rate is going to fall. And as a result of this exchange rate decrease, exports are going to increase. And if exports increase, then GDP will increase. All right, and last one, the last reason why the IS curve is negatively sloped. I'll put it on top here in green. If the interest rate decreases, again, if we move from 0.1 to 0.2 on the IS curve, then what normally happens, and this is probably the weakest part of this explanation because we're dealing with government behavior. So the reasoning is, the textbook reasoning is, if I goes down, then government would take more credit because it's cheaper, and it would spend more, and that would result in an increase in the national income level. What I'm going to do next is the following. I'm going to walk it back to explain the relationship between the interest rate and exports, because that previous explanation, well, I'm not sure it was a full explanation. So let's do that. So kind of fancy schmancy language here, right? Transmission process of interest rate variation, interest rate increases. And in plain English, what that means is, if the interest rate increases, how will this affect exports? So let's do that. Interest rate increases for whatever reason. And before I go any further, let us assume that initially ID was equal to IF. ID being the domestic interest rate, and IF being the foreign interest rate. So the question is, in which way would capital move if the domestic interest rate was identical to the foreign interest rate? The answer is capital would not move. There would be really no interest in capital moving. There would be no advantages, there would be no advantages, period. So there would be no capital flows, either inflows or outflows. Okay? However, what has just happened here is our interest rate went up. Our domestic interest rate went up. So what we have now is a variation. We have our domestic interest rate, which is higher than the foreign interest rate. So what's going to happen here? And here we're not talking about borrowing, we're talking about the international financial community attempting to place their wealth. So outflows or inflows into our financial pool, our financial markets, it's going to be it's going to cause inflows of capital, because our financial pool is paying our financial markets, our money markets, whatever you want to call them, they're paying a higher return on investment. So inflow of money. Now, when money enters our financial pool, it will create a greater demand for our currency. currency, yeah. So the demand for our hey, what's going on? The demand, the demand for our domestic currency is going to increase. And as a result, this greater demand is going to push up the value of domestic currency. So value goes up. Well, that's another way of saying that the exchange rate goes up. So if the exchange rate goes up, then the question becomes, what's going to happen to our exports? Are our goods and services cheaper or more expensive internationally? They're obviously more expensive, and as a result, exports will decrease. So that's the transmission process of interest rate variation. What? Meaning, what happens to exports as interest rates go up? And nextly, I'm going to do the opposite. Once again, transmission process of interest rate variation. In this case, however, the interest rate decreases. So quickly, let's see. Our domestic interest rate goes down. It's now lower than the foreign interest rate. So what's going to happen to international capital? Will it come in or will it go out? It'll go out. So there will be outflows, capital outflows. So what's going to happen to the demand? What's going to happen to the demand for our domestic currency? It's going to decrease. So what's going to happen to our exchange rate, to the international value of our currency? That's going to fall. And what will that do to exports? Well, our goods and services are more competitive internationally because our exchange rate has fallen. As a result, exports are going to go up. So when interest rates fall, exports have a tendency to increase. Shifts of the IS curve. So here we have the ISLM model. Interest rate, national income, IS curve. Let's call this IS1. Well, this is a shift. IS1 to IS2. And IS1 to IS3. Another shift. Increases of IS curve. Interest rate, national income, IS1 to IS2. That's an increase of the IS curve. And that is a rightward shift. So what causes increases of the IS curve? What causes rightward shifts of the IS curve? Well, again, the IS curve is the summation of the goods and services market. So anything which starts and affects the goods and services market is going to shift the IS curve. All right, so what would increase IS? An increase in government spending. Whether it's autonomous or non-autonomous, I don't think that's of any importance. So let me remove the little bar on top. All right. So let's go back to red. All right. What else? An increase in physical investments, an increase in consumption, an increase in exports, a decrease in the personal income tax rate, an increase in the marginal propensity to consume out of disposable income. Decreases of the IS curve. Interest rate, national income, IS1 to IS2. That's a decrease of IS. It's a leftward shift. Once again, the IS curve is a summation of the goods and services market. So anything which starts and affects the goods and services market will shift the IS curve. So what decreases the IS curve? What shifts it leftward? A decrease in G, a decrease in I, a decrease in C, a decrease in X, an increase in the personal income tax rate, a decrease in the marginal propensity to consume out of disposable income. And you could have, I didn't mention it when I was talking about an increase of the IS curve, but here I'll mention it. What could also decrease the IS curve is a fall in transfer payments. Okay. LM curve. Why is it positively sloped? Okay. Interest rate, GDP, and LM curve. Let's assume we start here, a point in the LM curve, and we go from that point to this point. So we're moving up and along the LM curve. Again, the question is, why is the LM curve positively sloped? First, we have to identify the causal relationship. Remember, regarding the IS curve, changes in the interest rate cause changes in national income. Regarding the LM curve, it's the opposite. Changes in GDP change the interest rate. All right? Okay. So, and keep in mind that the LM curve is the summation of the money market. So, why is the LM curve positively sloped? All right, let's see. If the income level goes up, again, this is the cause, a change in Y, and the change in the interest rate, that's the effect, that's the result. So if national income goes up, and there are many reasons why it may go up, right? An increase in I, an increase in C, an increase in G, etc., etc. So if national income goes up, what happens in the money market? Is it a supply event or is it a demand event? It's a demand event. So L, the money demand curve, increases. And what happens to the interest rate? The interest rate goes up. So this is a positive relationship. If income goes up, the interest rate goes up. And we're seeing this here. Moving from 1 to 2 implies that GDP has increased, and that has pushed up interest rates because of a greater demand for the money. Keeping in mind that money supply is constant. Well, we can also work it backwards, right? In other words, if the income level decreases, well, what happens to money demand? It'll fall. And as money demand falls, what happens to the interest rate? It decreases. So we would be going from 2 to 1, 0.2 on the LM curve to 0.1 on the LM curve. So that pretty much explains why the LM curve is positively sloped. Again, in most instances. Shifts of the LM curve. Interest rate, national income level. We'll start with this LM curve. So this would be a shift from LM1 to LM2, and this would be a shift from LM1 to LM3. Increases of the LM curve. Let's put the LM curve here. Interest rate, national income level, LM curve 1 to LM2, that's an increase in the LM curve, and that is a rightward shift. So what shifts the LM curve rightward? It's an increase in the money supply, in the money market, obviously, effectuated by the central bank. The central bank would be buying treasury bonds, or the central bank could be lowering the discount rate. These are the two most important tools of monetary policy, and that would increase the money supply, and in turn that would shift the LM curve rightward. Decrease of the LM curve. Again, interest rate, national income, LM1 to LM2. That would be a leftward shift. So what would be the cause of this leftward shift, this decrease of the LM curve? It would be due to a decrease in the money supply. Where? Well, in the money market. So let's go to the money market. what would we see there? Interest rate, a certain level of real balances, money supply, M over P, M being the nominal money supply in direct control of the central bank, P, remember, the general price level being predetermined or constant, so we only have to worry about M, the nominal money supply. Remember that together M over P is referred to as the real money supply. L being money demand, equilibrium interest rate, and the equilibrium level of real balances. So let's see. A decrease in the nominal money supply would shift, right? It would shift the real money supply curve leftward, and the equilibrium would move from E1 to E2, and that would increase the interest rate. And how do we translate this from the money market to the ISLM model? Well, that's the way we would translate it. A decrease in the money supply, a leftward shift of the money supply curve, would cause a leftward shift, a decrease in the LM curve. Example 1, a decrease in government spending. Let's assume that we're dealing with autonomous government spending. So first we go into the goods and services market. Aggregate expenditures, national income, 0. The now famous 45-degree help line, along which aggregate expenditures are equal to national income. Our starting point, autonomous aggregate expenditures 1, zip. This is the AE curve 1. This is the equilibrium level of aggregate expenditures 1, and the appropriate level of GDP. Okay. All right, that's our starting point in the goods and services market. And in the money market, we have the interest rate, real balances, money supply, M over P, and L. Equilibrium, which gives us this equilibrium interest rate and this level of real balances. All right. And now for the ISLM diagram, we would have the interest rate, national income, IS, 1, negatively sloped, LM, representing the money market, positively sloped, equilibrium interest rate, which is a reference to the interest rate of the money market, this level of national income, which is representative of the income level in the goods and services market. And now in red, I'm going to deal with this event. So it's a decrease in government spending. Where does it start? Does it start in the goods and services market, or does it start in the money market? it starts in the goods and services market, as government spending is part of aggregate expenditures. So this decrease in autonomous government spending will definitely affect the AE curve. Will it be a parallel or a non-parallel shift? It will definitely be a parallel shift down of the AE curve, and it would look like this. So this would be the new AE curve. Label it as 2. All right, and this would be the appropriate equilibrium, and this would be the new level of autonomous aggregate expenditures, lower than autonomous AE1. And what would happen to GDP? GDP would decrease from Y1 to Y2. And here we would just show a decrease in government spending. Okay. Now, so this decrease in government spending, which started in the goods and services market, will eventually spread into the money market. So the question is, will the money supply or money demand curve be affected? It's money demand. So money demand, given a lower level of national income, of spending, would mean a leftward shift of money demand from L1 to L2, a downward shift, a new equilibrium. And what would that do? In the money market, it would decrease the interest rate. What happens to money supply? Nothing happens to money supply, given that the central bank is not acting and the general price level is predetermined or constant. Okay, so we have drawn 2 conclusions from our analysis so far. One, from the goods and services market, GDP has fallen. And the other result drawn from the money market is that the interest rate has decreased. Now, these 2 conclusions will be summarized by the ISLM model, by the ISLM diagram. All right? So whatever I do, it has to have evident the conclusions that GDP has fallen and the interest rate has also fallen. So for the purposes of ISLM analysis, the question is, this decrease in government spending, is it an LM event or is it an IS event? It's definitely an IS event, because it's the goods and services market where the event started. So given a fall of government spending, we have a decrease in the IS curve, meaning a leftward shift of the IS curve from IS1 right there, to IS2, downward shift. So equilibrium would move from E1 to E2, and as you see, interest rates fall, but we already knew that from our money market analysis, and GDP decreases. Well, we already knew that from our goods and services market analysis here. All right, well, this is a ratatouille, but Nothing else to, well, let's leave it. Let's leave it here at this point. Example 2, there's an increase in the personal income tax rate. An increase in the personal income tax rate. So, once again, goods and services market. All right, we'll make these smaller. Aggregate expenditures, national income, 45-degree helpline, AE is equal to Y. I'll just put down 45 degrees. Well, let me do the whole thing. Help line. All right, it starts at 0. Sorry about that. This is the AE curve 1. This is the appropriate level of autonomous aggregate expenditures 1. This is equilibrium. Let's call it E1. This is the appropriate level of aggregate expenditures, and this is the appropriate level of GDP. In the money market, it looks like this. Interest rate, real balances, real money supply, M over P, and L. Right? L1. Okay. With the appropriate equilibrium interest rate, and the equilibrium real balances level, RB1. Right? And here we have the ISLM diagram. Interest rate, national income, negatively sloped IS, and a positively sloped LM. Equilibrium 1, which reflects the interest rate from the money market, and this level of GDP, or Y1, which reflects the identical GDP level in the goods and services market. Okay, switch colors, red. So let's deal with this event. There's an increase in the personal income tax rate. So this event, will it start in the goods and services market, or will it start in the money market? It will start in the goods and services market, because T, the personal income tax rate, is one of the components of aggregate expenditures. Next question, this increase in the personal income tax rate, will it be a parallel shift or a non-parallel shift of the aggregate expenditure curve? It's going to be a non-parallel shift of the aggregate expenditure curve, because it's the slope which changes. Keep in mind the model equation. Where is T? It's in the denominator, and it is the denominator which which is used in the calculation of the slope. So how do we normally calculate the slope? By looking at MPC, T, and MPI, marginal propensity to consume, the personal income tax rate, and the MPI, which is the marginal propensity to import. So if any one of these three changes, then the slope changes. If any one of these changes, the shift will not be a parallel shift. It will be a non-parallel shift, which is the case here. So the next question is, this non-parallel shift, will it be up or down? Well, it's going to be down because Let's work it this way. Because an increase in the personal income tax rate is going to lower disposable income. And in turn, this is going to lower consumption. And in turn, this is going to lower aggregate expenditures. And then in turn, that's going to lower the GDP level. All right, so it's going to be a non-parallel shift down of the AE curve. So the new AE curve is going to start at the previous level of autonomous aggregate expenditures, because autonomous expenditures have not changed here. So it's a downward shift. So this would be the new AE curve that we would label AE curve 2. All right. So it's a downward non-parallel shift, again, which is due to an increase in T. And what we have is a new level, what we have is a new equilibrium, E2, with a new level of aggregate expenditures and a new level of GDP. So what happened? GDP decreases. This is a conclusion that is going to be shown also using the ISLM model. Now, once again, anything which starts in the goods and services market, any economic event, will eventually spread into the money market and vice versa also. All right, so what happens in a money market given this increase in the personal income tax rate? And again, the question is, this increase in the personal income tax rate, is it a money supply or a money demand event? It's a money demand event. Here the Fed is not acting and the price is constant, so the real money supply does not change. So it's definitely a money demand event. So given higher taxes, will there be a greater or smaller demand for money? Here we're dealing with consumers. A lower demand for money, a lower demand for liquidity. So L will decrease from L1 to L2. That's a leftward shift of the money demand curve. Okay, so we have a new equilibrium, E2, and what do we have? We have a lower interest rate, right? No change in RB, right? No change in real balances. Again, because the Fed has not done anything, the central bank has not done anything, and the general price level is at the same constant level. All right, so what happened to the interest rate in the money market? It decreased. Okay, now how do we show this event, this increase in the personal income tax rate using the ISLM model? Well, again, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to verify the decrease in the interest rate, which is the conclusion drawn from the money market, and we're going to also have to show the decrease in the GDP level, which is the conclusion drawn from the goods and services market. So for the ISLM model analysis, the question is, this increase in the personal income tax rate, is it a IS or an LM event? It's an IS event because it's the goods and services market where the event started. So the IS curve will decrease. It will move. It will move in a leftward leftward direction. So it would look like this. This is the new IS curve, IS2. New equilibrium. And what do we notice? Well, the same conclusion that we drew in the money market, right? A decrease in the interest rate. And what's the conclusion about the GDP level? It decreases, which is the conclusion which we already drew from the goods and services market. Okay, so let's do one more example. Third and last example, it's an increase in the money supply. It's an increase in M. Okay, so GNS, goods and services market. Whoops, aggregate expenditures, GDP, 45-degree help line. Whoops, I forgot to mark that along the 45-degree help line. Aggregate expenditures are equal to national income. Here we have the level of autonomous aggregate expenditures. This is AE curve 1, our initial equilibrium, initial level of aggregate expenditures, initial level of GDP. Over in the money market, we have interest rate, real balances, M over P, that is the real money supply. L, that's money demand, equilibrium, this is the equilibrium interest rate, and this is the equilibrium level of real balances. All right, and the last part is the ISLM diagram. All right, interest rate and GDP. IS, a summary of the goods and services market, and the LM curve, a summary of the money market. Equilibrium, equilibrium interest rate, equilibrium level of GDP. Okay, now in red, an increase in the money supply. Where does it start? In the goods and services market, or in the money market? It starts, for obvious reasons, in the money market. It's going to be a rightward shift of M over P. M1 versus M2. Which is greater? M2 is greater than M1, thus causing this rightward shift, because P is constant, it's predetermined. So this increase in the money supply, it shifts the money supply curve to the right, and now we have a new equilibrium, E2, and that will drop the interest rate from I1 to I2, and it will also increase the real balances level from RB1 to RB2. Okay, now what happens in the goods and services market? Will it be affected? Of course, these markets are very much interrelated. What starts in the money market will eventually hit the goods and services market, and we already saw on numerous occasions that whatever starts in the goods and services market will eventually move towards the money market. So what happens in the goods and services market? Well, let's see. Lower interest rates. Lower interest rates are going to increase aggregate expenditures. Why? Well, because given lower interest rates, what will happen to physical investments? They'll go up. What will happen to consumption? It's going to go up. What will happen to exports? Go up. What happens to government spending? It'll go up. So all of that means that there's going to be a shift up of the aggregate expenditure curve. So let's label this as AE curve 2. All right, so what happens here? Well, we have a new equilibrium, which means that aggregate expenditures have gone up, and which means that GDP has gone up. All right, so AE1 to AE2. But our concern is mainly here, right? So that's our conclusion about GDP. It increases. And this is the conclusion from the money market, lower interest rates. So again, the ISLM model, it summarizes the goods and services market through the IS curve, and it summarizes the money market through the LM curve. So let's go back to the event, this increase in the money supply. Question, this increase in the money supply, is this a IS event or an LM event? It's an LM event, because the LM curve represents the money market, and it is in a money market where the event started. So what happens to the LM curve? It shifts rightward. It's an increase of the LM curve brought about by an increase in the money supply. So it'll be LM1 to LM2. It's a rightward shift. We have a new equilibrium, E2, and a lower interest rate. Just as we've already shown this, let me use a different color, green. We've already shown this here, right? Lower interest rates. Back to red, and a higher level of GDP, right? Higher level of GDP. But we already knew that from the conclusion from the goods and services market. Okay, I'm done.